The lightning split the sky open like a knife through canvas, and Harrison Reeves saw her body crumpled at the bottom of the ravine just as the thunder shook the earth beneath his boots. Rain hammered down in sheets so thick he could barely see past his horse's ears, but there was no mistaking the pale dress plastered against rocks 30 feet below, or the dark hair spread across the muddy ground like spilled ink. Harrison's gelding danced nervously as another crack of lightning illuminated the gully, and for half a heartbeat he considered riding on. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and the trail back to Butte, Montana was already treacherous enough without stopping to investigate what might be a corpse. But something in the way her hand was outstretched, fingers slightly curled as if reaching for help, made him swing down from the saddle before his practical mind could argue otherwise. The rocks were slick under his hands as he worked his way down the ravine wall, his boots sliding in the mud, his rope tied around a sturdy pine trunk above. Rain poured down his neck, soaking through his shirt and vest until they clung to his skin like a second hide. He'd been riding fence lines for the past 6 hours, checking for breaks after the dry spell finally ended with this hellish downpour, and he was bone tired. But the woman below hadn't moved once since he'd spotted her, and he'd be damned if he left her to drown in the rapidly rising water at the bottom of the gully. When his boots finally hit the ravine floor, Harrison slogged through ankle-deep water to reach her. She was young, maybe 20 or 21, with a face that would have been pretty if it wasn't streaked with mud and blood from a gash above her left temple. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and hem, suggesting a fall from above, and when he pressed 2 fingers against her throat, he felt the faint flutter of a pulse. Alive then, but unconscious and losing heat fast in the cold rain. Harrison didn't waste time wondering what a woman was doing out here alone, miles from town. He worked his arms beneath her shoulders and knees, lifting her against his chest as gently as he could manage. She was lighter than he expected, almost fragile in his arms, and he felt a surge of anger at whoever had let her wander into danger like this. The climb back up would be brutal with her deadweight in his arms, but there was no other choice. The water was already rising around his ankles, fed by countless streams pouring down from the hills above. The ascent nearly killed them both. Harrison had to hold her with one arm while hauling them up the rope with the other, his muscles screaming with the effort, his boots fighting for purchase on the slick rock face. Twice he slipped and caught himself only by sheer stubborn will, the woman's body pressed between him and the stone. Rain blinded him, filled his mouth when he gasped for air, and turned the rope rough and slippery in his grip. But he climbed, inch by agonizing inch, until finally his hand closed over the edge and he dragged them both onto solid ground. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, the woman sprawled half across him. Then another boom of thunder reminded him they weren't safe yet. He gathered her up again and stumbled to where his gelding waited, head down against the storm. Getting her into the saddle took some doing, but Harrison finally managed to mount behind her, holding her upright against his chest with one arm while he gathered the reins with the other. The ride back to his ranch took nearly an hour through the driving rain. Harrison lived alone in a sturdy cabin about 5 miles outside Butte, running a small spread of cattle that kept him fed and clothed, but would never make him rich. He'd built the place himself 3 years ago after drifting through half a dozen territories, finally deciding Montana was as good a place as any to put down roots. At 26, he figured it was time to stop running from ghosts and make something of himself. The cabin wasn't much, but it was solid, with a good stone fireplace and a roof that didn't leak. He carried the woman inside and laid her on his bed, the only real piece of furniture beyond a table and 2 chairs. She still hadn't stirred, which worried him more than he wanted to admit. Harrison stripped off her muddy boots and the ruined dress, trying not to notice the curves of her body as he wrapped her in every blanket he owned. Her skin was ice cold, and her lips had taken on a bluish tinge. He built up the fire until it roared, filling the cabin with heat, then stood there dripping on his own floor, uncertain what to do next. The cut on her head had stopped bleeding but looked ugly. Harrison heated water and cleaned it as best he could, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he worked. He doctored plenty of animals and a few men in his time, but never a woman, especially not one who looked like she belonged in a painting rather than bleeding on his bed. Her face was delicate, with high cheekbones and a mouth that probably smiled easy when she wasn't unconscious. Dark lashes lay against her pale cheeks like shadows. He changed into dry clothes and made coffee, black and strong, then sat in his chair near the fire to wait. The storm raged outside, rattling the windows and howling down the chimney. Lightning continued to flash, illuminating the cabin's single room in stark bursts of white light. Harrison watched the woman breathe, counting the rise and fall of her chest under the blankets, and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. She woke near dawn as the storm finally began to break. Harrison had dozed off in his chair, head tilted back against the wall, when a small sound jerked him alert. The woman's eyes were open, wide and brown and filled with confusion as she stared at the unfamiliar ceiling above her. When she turned her head and saw him, fear flashed across her face. "Easy," Harrison said, not moving from his chair. "You're safe. I found you in a ravine during the storm. You were unconscious." She blinked at him, her brow furrowing as she tried to process his words. Her hand crept up to touch the bandage he'd wrapped around her head, and she winced. "I don't remember," she whispered, her voice rough and uncertain. "I don't remember what happened." Harrison leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Can you tell me your name, where you were headed?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes grew distant, searching for something that clearly wasn't there. "Josephine," she finally said. "Josephine Zimmerman. I was traveling to Butte from Helena with my uncle. We were in a wagon." Her face went pale. "There was an accident. The horses spooked during the storm. I remember the wagon tipping and then nothing else." "Where's your uncle now?" "I don't know." Her voice broke on the words and tears welled in her eyes. "I don't know. He could be hurt. He could be dead. I have to find him." She tried to sit up, but Harrison was across the room in 3 strides, his hand firm but gentle on her shoulder. "You're not going anywhere yet. You took a bad knock to the head and you've been out for hours. The storm's barely passed. Soon as it's light enough, I'll ride out and look for the wagon and your uncle. But you need to rest." Josephine stared up at him, and he saw the moment she realized she was wearing only her underclothes beneath the blankets. Color flooded her cheeks, and she pulled the coverings up to her chin. "You undressed me. Your clothes were soaked through. You were half frozen. I didn't have much choice." Harrison stepped back, giving her space. "I didn't do anything improper, if that's what you're worried about." She studied his face for a long moment, and whatever she saw there must have satisfied her because she nodded slowly. "I believe you, and thank you for pulling me out of that ravine. I remember the water now, how it was rising. I would have drowned." "Probably," Harrison agreed. He moved to the stove and poured a cup of coffee, then brought it to her. "Can you drink this? It'll warm you up from the inside." Josephine struggled to sit up without letting the blankets fall, and Harrison grabbed an extra shirt from his trunk, handing it to her. She pulled it on under the covers with some awkward maneuvering, and he politely turned away until she cleared her throat. The shirt hung on her like a tent, the shoulders drooping and the hem reaching past her knees. She looked young and vulnerable and impossibly out of place in his rough cabin. She took the coffee gratefully, wrapping both hands around the tin cup and breathing in the steam. "Where exactly are we?" "My ranch, about 5 miles south of Butte. You must have been traveling the main road when you had your accident. That ravine runs parallel to it for a good stretch." "How long have I been unconscious?" "Found you around 6 yesterday evening. It's near dawn now, so close to 12 hours. Harrison refilled his own cup and leaned against the table. "You remember anything else about the accident? Which direction the wagon might have gone?" "Whether your uncle was thrown clear." Josephine closed her eyes, her face tightening with concentration. "We were about halfway through the journey. Uncle Martin was driving. The storm came up so fast. The horses panicked when lightning struck a tree right beside the road. I felt the wagon tip and I was thrown. That's all I remember." "Martin Zimmerman? I don't know the name. He from Helena?" "Yes, he's a merchant there. We were coming to Butte because he has business contacts in town. I was going to stay with him for a while, help him with his bookkeeping." She looked down at the coffee, her throat working. "He's the only family I have left. My parents died 2 years ago from influenza. Uncle Martin took me in." Harrison heard the fear beneath her words and felt an unexpected tug of sympathy. He knew what it was like to be alone in the world, to have your family torn away. "I'll find him," he promised, surprised by his own certainty. "Soon as there's enough light, I'll ride out and search the area. If he's hurt, I'll bring him back here. If the wagon's intact, I'll at least find your belongings." "I'm coming with you." "No, you're not. You can barely sit up without swaying. You've got a head wound and you've been through hell. You'll stay here and rest." Josephine's jaw set in a stubborn line that told Harrison this was going to be an argument. "He's my uncle. My responsibility. I won't sit here safe while he might be dying somewhere. And what good will you do him if you fall off a horse and crack your skull open? Or pass out and I have to spend time rescuing you instead of searching for him?" Harrison kept his voice level but firm. "Use your head, Miss Zimmerman. The best thing you can do for your uncle right now is stay put and let me do my job." She looked like she wanted to argue more, but finally she nodded, her shoulders slumping. "You're right. I hate it, but you're right." She met his eyes. "Promise me you'll look everywhere. Promise me you won't give up." "I promise." Harrison saddled his horse as soon as the sun broke through the tattered clouds, leaving Josephine with instructions to keep the fire going and eat something from his meager stores. She'd insisted she felt fine, but he could see the pallor beneath her skin and the way she moved carefully, like her head ached. He'd left his rifle propped by the door, though he doubted she'd need it. His ranch was remote enough that visitors were rare. The morning was cold and fresh-washed, everything dripping and sparkling in the new light. Harrison followed the trail back toward the ravine where he'd found Josephine, his eyes scanning the muddy road for any sign of a wagon. He found it about 2 miles from the spot where she'd fallen, overturned in a ditch with one wheel completely shattered. The horses were gone, probably broken free and run off during the chaos. Supplies were scattered everywhere, trunks broken open and their contents strewn across the wet ground. But there was no sign of Martin Zimmerman. Harrison searched the immediate area, calling out, checking behind rocks and in the brush. He found a man's hat caught on a bush and a single boot half buried in mud, but nothing else. The boot worried him. A man didn't lose a boot unless something violent had happened. He widened his search, following a trail of disturbed vegetation that led away from the wagon and deeper into the hills. He found the merchant an hour later, wedged between 2 rocks about a quarter-mile from the crash site. Martin Zimmerman was a portly man in his late 40s, with graying hair and a face that had probably been jovial before fear and pain twisted it. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and there was a massive bruise spreading across the left side of his face. But he was breathing, and when Harrison carefully shook his shoulder, his eyes fluttered open. "Easy now," Harrison said. "I'm here to help. Your niece is safe. Josephine is safe." At her name, Martin's eyes focused, and he tried to speak. His voice came out as barely a croak. "Joe, the wagon. I couldn't find her. She's at my ranch resting. She's got a bump on the head, but she'll be fine. Right now we need to get you out of here and set that leg." Harrison looked at the man's position and grimaced. This was going to hurt like hell. "I'm going to have to move you." "I'm sorry, but there's no way around it." What followed was 30 minutes of the worst kind of work. Martin screamed when Harrison pulled him free of the rocks, and he passed out cold when Harrison straightened the broken leg enough to splint it with branches and torn strips from a shirt Harrison found near the wagon. He loaded the unconscious man across his horse and led them both back at a careful walk, praying the merchant wouldn't wake up and thrash around. Josephine was standing in the doorway when Harrison rode up, wrapped in one of his blankets, her face anxious. When she saw the figure draped across the horse, she rushed forward with a cry. "Uncle Martin! Oh God, is he alive?" "He's alive, but he's in a bad way. Broken leg, possible cracked ribs, and who knows what else. Help me get him inside." Together they maneuvered Martin into the cabin and onto the bed, Josephine hovering anxiously as Harrison examined him more thoroughly. The merchant woke briefly, delirious with pain, and Josephine held his hand and spoke soothingly until he quieted again. Harrison wished he had laudanum or whiskey to ease the man's suffering, but his supplies were limited. He did what he could, binding the ribs he suspected were cracked and wrapping the splinted leg more securely. "He needs a real doctor," Josephine said quietly, watching her uncle's shallow breathing. "He needs proper care." "Agreed. But he can't be moved yet, not until that leg has some time to start healing. Moving him now might kill him. Best we can do is keep him comfortable and watch for fever." Harrison straightened, his back protesting after the long morning. "I'll ride into Butte tomorrow and fetch Doc Morrison. He can tell us better what needs to be done." Josephine nodded, but she didn't move from her uncle's side. Harrison left her there and went back out to retrieve what he could salvage from the wagon. He made 3 trips, bringing back trunks of clothes, supplies, and personal items. Most of it was ruined by the rain, but some things had survived. He found a carpet bag that seemed to be Josephine's and brought it in, setting it quietly by the door. That evening, Harrison made a simple stew while Josephine tended her uncle. The cabin was crowded now with 3 people in a space meant for 1, but there was nothing to be done about it. Harrison would sleep on the floor and give them the bed. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd survived worse. Josephine finally left Martin's side when Harrison pressed a bowl of stew into her hands. She sat at the table, eating mechanically, her eyes distant. "I've been thinking about what happened," she said quietly. "The timing of it all. We left Helena 3 days ago. We should have reached Butte yesterday afternoon, but Uncle Martin wanted to stop and rest the horses. If we'd pushed on, we would have been in town before the storm hit." "Second guessing doesn't help anything," Harrison said. "Could have, would have, should have. It'll drive you mad if you let it." "You always live alone out here?" The question surprised him with its directness. "I do. Been that way for 3 years now since I built this place." "Doesn't it get lonely?" Harrison considered that as he ate his own stew. "Sometimes, but I prefer my own company to most people's. The world tends to be simpler when it's just you and the land." Josephine studied him over the rim of her bowl. In the firelight, her eyes were warm, intelligent. "You don't strike me as a simple man, Mr. Reeves." "Harrison, and I'm simple enough. I work my land, I tend my cattle, and I keep to myself. Nothing complicated about that." "You risked your life to save a stranger in a storm. That's not simple." That's heroic. Harrison felt heat climb his neck that had nothing to do with the fire. It's what anyone would have done. No, Josephine said softly. It's not. Most people would have ridden past. Most people wouldn't have climbed down into that ravine in the pouring rain to save someone they'd never met. You could have died doing that. Harrison didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. They finished their meal in silence, but it was a comfortable silence, born of shared exhaustion and relief. Martin slept fitfully, murmuring occasionally in his sleep, and Josephine checked on him twice before Harrison finally convinced her to rest. "I'll watch him tonight," Harrison said. "You need sleep as much as he does. That head wound of yours is no joke." "I'm fine." "You're running on nerves and worry. Get some rest, Miss Zimmerman. That's an order." She smiled despite herself, a small curve of her lips that transformed her face. "You're very bossy." "So I've been told." She settled on the far side of the bed, next to her uncle, while Harrison made himself as comfortable as he could on the floor near the fire. He listened to the sounds of her breathing evening out, watched the shadows dance across the ceiling, and wondered how his simple life had gotten so complicated in the span of a single day. Doc Morrison arrived the following afternoon, a thin man with clever hands and sharp eyes. He examined Martin thoroughly while Harrison and Josephine waited outside, giving him space to work. When he finally emerged, his expression was grave. "The leg's bad, but not hopeless. If it heals straight, he might walk without a limp." "Might not, though. The ribs are cracked, but they'll heal on their own if he stays still. What worries me is this fever he's got brewing. Could just be from the trauma, but it could turn into something worse. He needs careful nursing and watching. Any sign that fever gets worse, you send for me immediately." He looked between them. "Can you manage that here, or should we try to move him to town?" "Moving him would be dangerous," Josephine said before Harrison could answer. "We'll care for him here. I know some nursing. My mother taught me before she passed." Doc Morrison nodded approvingly. "Good. Keep him still. Keep him clean and get fluids into him whenever he's awake enough to swallow. I'll come back in 3 days to check on him." He accepted the coins Harrison pressed into his hand and rode off, leaving them with a packet of powders for pain and instructions written in careful script. The days that followed fell into a pattern. Josephine devoted herself to nursing her uncle, barely sleeping, always at his side when he woke confused or in pain. Harrison handled everything else, cooking meals, tending his cattle, keeping the cabin in order. They worked around each other in the small space with surprising ease, developing an unspoken understanding about who would do what and when. Martin's fever broke on the 4th day, and after that his recovery progressed steadily. He was a good patient, stoic about the pain and grateful for everything they did. When he was lucid enough to talk, he thanked Harrison profusely for saving both him and his niece. "I owe you a debt I can never repay," Martin said, gripping Harrison's hand with surprising strength. "You saved our lives, both of us. If there's ever anything I can do for you, anything at all, you only have to ask." "You don't owe me anything," Harrison said, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "I did what needed doing." "Nevertheless, I'm a man who pays his debts, Mr. Reeves. You'll find I have a long memory for kindness." As Martin improved, Josephine finally allowed herself to rest properly. Harrison would find her asleep in the chair by the fire, her head tilted at an angle that would make her neck ache, or dozing at the table with her arms folded as a pillow. She'd insisted on giving Harrison back his bed once her uncle was out of danger, making her own sleeping space on the floor despite his protests. They were both too stubborn for their own good, he decided. It was during those quiet evenings after Martin fell asleep that Harrison and Josephine talked. She told him about her life in Helena, about her parents and their small bookshop, about how influenza had swept through town 2 winters ago and taken them both within days of each other. About how lost she'd felt afterwards, how Uncle Martin had been kind but distant, giving her a place to stay but treating her more like a guest than family. Harrison found himself telling her things he'd never told anyone. About his own parents, who died when he was 16. His father from a bullet during a robbery and his mother from grief 6 months later. About his years drifting, working ranches from Texas to Wyoming, never staying anywhere long because staying meant putting down roots and roots meant having something to lose. About how he'd finally come to Montana because he was tired of running and figured it was time to face the fact that living meant risking loss, and isolation wasn't the same as safety. "You're braver than you give yourself credit for," Josephine said one night, her face soft in the firelight. "Building a life for yourself after all that, starting over. I don't know about brave, stubborn maybe." Harrison poked at the fire, watching sparks spiral up the chimney. "Sometimes I think I'm just going through the motions. Building something because that's what people do, not because I actually believe in it." I understand that feeling. After my parents died, I felt like I was play-acting at being alive, going through the routines but not really feeling any of it. She paused. "But being here, taking care of Uncle Martin, talking with you like this, I feel more real than I have in 2 years. Isn't that strange?" Harrison looked at her across the fire and felt something shift in his chest. She was beautiful, he'd noticed that from the start, but it was more than that. She was strong and capable and unafraid to show her vulnerability. She laughed easily when Martin said something amusing, and she cried without shame when she was overwhelmed. She was completely alive in a way that made Harrison realize how much of himself he'd been holding back. "It's not strange," he said quietly. "I feel it too." Their eyes met and held, and Harrison saw the moment she understood what he was saying. Color rose in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Harrison," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. But before either of them could say more, Martin coughed loudly from the bed, breaking the spell. Josephine jumped up to check on him, and the moment was gone. Harrison sat by the fire long after she'd settled her uncle and returned to her makeshift bed on the floor, wondering what would have happened if Martin hadn't interrupted, wondering if he'd just imagined the answering warmth in her eyes. 3 weeks after the accident, Martin was well enough to sit up and take short walks around the cabin, leaning heavily on a crutch Harrison fashioned from a sturdy branch. He was determined to regain his strength, pushing himself harder than Doc Morrison recommended, eager to get back to his business in town. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough," Martin declared one morning. "As soon as I can manage a wagon ride, Josephine and I will move into town. I can rent rooms at the boarding house until I complete my business here." Harrison felt something cold settle in his stomach at those words, but he kept his expression neutral. "You should wait until Doc Morrison says you're ready. No point risking a setback now." "I'm ready now." "Or I will be in a few days. Josephine, start packing our things. We've been a burden to Mr. Reeves for too long." Josephine looked between her uncle and Harrison, her expression troubled. "Uncle Martin, Harrison doesn't seem to mind. Do you, Harrison?" "You're no burden," Harrison said carefully. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." But Martin was already shaking his head. "You've been more than generous, but we can't continue to impose. Besides, I need to be in butt proper to conduct my business. I've already lost weeks of time." "No, our minds are made up. We'll leave in 3 days." Those 3 days passed far too quickly. Harrison threw himself into ranch work, riding fence lines and checking cattle, anything to avoid thinking about the rapidly approaching departure. Josephine was quieter than usual, going about the task of packing with a subdued efficiency that made Harrison's chest ache. On the second evening, she found him outside checking his tack by lamplight, even though there was no reason to be doing it then. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the cool mountain air and came to stand beside him. "You're avoiding me," she said without preamble, Harrison's hands stilled on the leather. "I'm working. You're hiding. There's a difference." She moved closer, and he caught the scent of soap and something uniquely her. "Harrison, look at me." He did, reluctantly, and found her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I don't want to leave," she said, her voice breaking. "These past weeks, living here, being with you, I've been happier than I've been since my parents died. I know that probably sounds foolish, given the circumstances, but it's true. It's not foolish." Harrison set down the bridle he'd been pretending to examine and turned to face her fully. "I don't want you to leave either. These weeks with you have been the best I've had since I came to Montana, maybe the best I've had in my whole life. Then ask me to stay." The words hung between them, full of possibility and danger. Harrison wanted nothing more than to pull her into his arms and promise her anything, everything, if she'd just stay with him. But reality intruded, cold and hard. "I can't. You have your uncle to think about, your life in Helena. I'm just a rancher living alone in the middle of nowhere." "What kind of life could I offer you? A real one?" Josephine stepped close enough that he could feel her warmth. "I don't care about comfort or society or any of that. I care about you, about who you are and how you make me feel, like I matter, like I'm seen. You do matter. God, Josephine, you matter so much it scares me." Harrison reached out and cupped her face, his thumb brushing away a tear that had escaped. "But your uncle depends on you. His business, his recovery, all of it. I can't ask you to abandon him for me." "You're not asking, I'm offering." She covered his hand with hers, pressing it against her cheek. "We could talk to him, explain how we feel. Maybe he'd understand. Or maybe he'd think I took advantage of you while you were vulnerable and under my roof. Maybe he'd think I'm some opportunist looking for a wife to cook and clean for me." Harrison's voice was rough with emotion. "I won't have you choosing me and losing your family because of it. I know what it's like to have no one, Josephine. I won't be the reason you experience that." She was crying openly now, and Harrison felt answering moisture in his own eyes. "So this is it. We just say goodbye and pretend these weeks meant nothing. They meant everything. That's why I have to let you go." He pulled her against his chest, holding her tight while she cried. "If it's meant to be, we'll find our way back to each other. But right now, you need to go with your uncle. Make sure he's fully recovered. Think about what you really want without me here influencing you. I already know what I want. Then you'll still know it in a few months. And if you do, if you still feel the same, you know where to find me." Harrison pressed a kiss to the top of her head, breathing in her scent, memorizing the feel of her in his arms. "I'll be here, Josephine. I'm not going anywhere." They stood like that for a long time, holding each other under the Montana stars, until finally she pulled back and wiped her eyes. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you won't close yourself off again. Promise me you'll stay open to the possibility of us, even if it seems impossible." "I promise." She rose on her toes and kissed him then, a soft press of lips that held all the words they couldn't say. Harrison kissed her back, gentle and reverent, trying to pour everything he felt into that one perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, they were both shaking. "3 months," Josephine whispered. "Give me 3 months to settle Uncle Martin and think things through. If I haven't come back to you by then, you'll know I've chosen differently. And if you do come back," she smiled through her tears, "then you better be ready to make an honest woman of me, Harrison Reeves." Harrison borrowed a wagon from his neighbor and drove Martin and Josephine into Butte the next morning. The ride was quiet, all three of them lost in their own thoughts. Martin sat in the back, his leg propped on cushions, looking pleased to be finally returning to civilization. Josephine sat beside Harrison on the bench, close enough that their thighs touched, and every bump in the road pressed them together in bittersweet reminder of what they were leaving behind. But was a bustling mining town, bigger than Harrison usually liked, full of noise and people and commerce. He helped Martin into the boarding house and carried their salvaged belongings inside, then stood awkwardly in the street while Josephine got her uncle settled in his room. When she finally came back down, her eyes were red but dry. He's resting. The journey tired him more than he wanted to admit. She looked up at Harrison, her hand finding his. I meant what I said last night. 3 months. I'll write to you if that's all right. I'd like that. Harrison squeezed her hand, not caring who might see. Take care of yourself, Josephine Zimmerman. Take care of that stubborn heart of yours. You take care of yours, too. She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek, quick and chaste but full of promise. 3 months, Harrison, wait for me. Then she was gone, disappearing into the boarding house, and Harrison was left standing in the street with an empty wagon and a heart that felt too big for his chest. He climbed back onto the bench and drove home slowly, the miles stretching long and lonely ahead of him. The cabin felt cavernous without them. Harrison threw himself into work, repairing fences that didn't need repairing, cutting firewood until his woodpile was twice the size it needed to be, anything to keep his mind occupied. But every evening when he sat by the fire, he felt their absence like a physical ache. The cabin still smelled faintly of Josephine's soap. Her makeshift bed on the floor was gone, but he could still see the impression in his mind. True to her word, Josephine's first letter arrived 2 weeks later, delivered by a boy from town. Harrison nearly crushed it in his eagerness to open it, his heart pounding as he unfolded the careful script. Dear Harrison, it began. Uncle Martin is settling into his business in Butte. He's made contacts with several mining operations and seems optimistic about future contracts. His leg continues to heal, though he complains about the pain when it rains. He asks after you often and speaks of you with great fondness. I think he suspects there's more between us than simple gratitude, but he hasn't said anything directly. As for me, I find myself thinking of you constantly. I help Uncle Martin with his bookkeeping during the days, but my mind wanders to your cabin, to those evenings by the fire, to the sound of your voice when you told me about your life. I miss you terribly, Harrison. Some days the missing is so strong I can barely breathe around it. But I'm trying to do as you asked, to think clearly about what I want without the intensity of those weeks clouding my judgment. The thing is, the more time passes, the clearer it becomes. I don't want the life Uncle Martin envisions for me, helping him with his business and eventually marrying some merchant or clerk. I want a real life, with someone who sees me as a partner, not a convenience. I want to build something meaningful with someone I respect and admire and, yes, love. I think I've loved you since that moment in your cabin when you promised to find my uncle. Maybe even before that, when you carried me up from that ravine in the rain. But I gave my word I'd give this 3 months, and I will. I owe you that much honesty, that much certainty. So I'll wait and I'll think and I'll write to you each week. And when the 3 months are up, I'll have my answer. Yours, Josephine. Harrison read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and tucked it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He sat down immediately and wrote his reply, his usually steady hand shaking slightly as he formed the words. Dear Josephine, your letter found me well, though lonely without your company. The cabin echoes without you and your uncle filling it with conversation and life. I find myself cooking meals and automatically making 3 portions, only to remember there's just me now to feed. I'm glad to hear Martin is healing and finding success with his business. He's a good man, and he deserves good fortune after what happened. Please give him my regards when you see him. As for missing you, I understand that breathless feeling all too well. I wake up every morning hoping to see you by the fire, brewing coffee and humming whatever tune has caught in your head. I go about my days and think of things I want to tell you, little observations or stories that I'd save up to share in the evening. And then I remember you're not here and the day seems a little less bright. But I stand by what I said. Take the time you need. Be certain. I'll be here when you're ready, whatever you decide. Though I'll confess I'm hoping with everything in me that your decision brings you back to my door. Write to me whenever you wish. Your letters are the best part of my weeks. Yours, Harrison. They wrote each other faithfully after that, weekly letters that grew longer and more personal as the weeks passed. Josephine told him about life in Butte, the boarding house's eccentric residents, her uncle's growing business success. She asked about his cattle, his ranch, the weather. She told him she'd bought fabric to make new curtains for his cabin and asked what color he preferred. She sent him a book of poetry she thought he'd like. Harrison told her about a late snow that caught him by surprise, about a difficult calving he managed successfully, about the eagle he saw hunting near his north pasture. He confessed he'd read the poetry book 3 times and had one particular poem memorized because it reminded him of her. He told her he didn't care what color the curtains were, as long as she was the one hanging them. 2 months passed, then 2.5. Harrison counted the days like a man counting down to his execution or his salvation. He wasn't sure which. With each letter from Josephine, his hope grew stronger, but so did his fear. What if she changed her mind? What if her uncle talked her out of it? What if she realized she wanted more than a simple rancher could provide? Then, with a week remaining in their agreed-upon 3 months, Martin Zimmerman appeared at Harrison's door. Harrison was mucking out the small barn when he heard the wagon approach. He stepped out, shading his eyes against the afternoon sun, and felt his stomach drop when he recognized Martin driving a new wagon, pulled by a matched pair of horses. The older man's leg was still splinted, but he moved with increasing confidence as he climbed down. "Martin, this is a surprise." Harrison wiped his hands on his pants and tried to read the merchant's expression. "Is everything all right? Is Josephine okay?" "She's fine. Thriving, in fact. May I come in? We need to talk." Those 4 words sent dread coursing through Harrison's veins. He led Martin into the cabin and offered him coffee, which the older man accepted. They sat across from each other at the table, and Harrison waited for whatever blow was about to fall. Martin took a long sip of coffee, then set the cup down carefully. "I'm not a foolish man, Harrison. I've seen how my niece looks when your letters arrive. I've read the happiness in her face when she writes her replies, and I remember how you two were together during my recovery. I'd have to be blind not to see what's between you. Sir, I never tried to take advantage. Everything between us happened honestly. I have the utmost respect for Josephine. I know that. If I thought otherwise, we wouldn't be having this conversation." Martin leaned back in his chair. "You saved both our lives, Harrison. You took us in and cared for us without asking for anything in return. You're a good man, and you've clearly made Josephine happier than I've seen her since her parents died. But I need to know your intentions are honorable. She's my responsibility, the last family I have. I need to know you'll take care of her." Hope flared bright in Harrison's chest. "Are you saying you'd approve if Josephine and I wanted to be together?" "I'm saying I'm not going to stand in your way, but I'm also saying I need assurances. Josephine deserves a stable home, a man who'll cherish her, a future with possibilities. Can you provide that?" Harrison met Martin's eyes steadily. "I love your niece, sir. I've loved her since those days when she sat by your bedside and refused to give up on you. She's the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever met, and I'd count myself the luckiest man alive if she chose to spend her life with me. As for providing for her, my ranch isn't much, but it's solid. I turn a profit most years, enough to live comfortably if not extravagantly. I can expand if needed. I can build a bigger house, buy more cattle. Whatever it takes to give her a good life, I'll do it." Martin nodded slowly. "That's what I hoped you'd say. So here's what I'm proposing. My business in Butt has gone better than expected. I'm negotiating contracts that will keep me here for at least another year, maybe longer. I need someone I can trust to manage the financial side of things, someone with a sharp mind and attention to detail. Josephine has been helping me, and she's better at it than I ever was. If you and she decide to marry, I'd like to offer you both a partnership. You'd keep your ranch, but you'd also have income from the business. It would give you security and flexibility." Harrison blinked, stunned by the offer. "That's incredibly generous, but I don't know anything about business. I'm a cattleman, and you'll stay one. But Josephine could handle the business side with your input when needed. It would give her purpose beyond just ranch work, something I know matters to her. And it would give you both a cushion, financial stability. Think of it as my way of repaying the debt I owe you. You don't owe me anything. I owe you everything. Let me do this, Harrison. Let me help you build a life with my niece if that's what you both want." Martin's expression softened. "She loves you. She told me so last week. Said she was counting the days until she could come back to you with clear conscience, having given the situation the thought you asked for. So I'm here to ask you directly. When those 3 months are up, when Josephine comes to your door, what will you say to her?" Harrison didn't hesitate. "I'll ask her to marry me. I'll promise to love her and protect her and stand beside her for as long as I live. I'll do everything in my power to make her happy." Martin stood and extended his hand. "Then you have my blessing, son. Welcome to the family." They shook hands, and Harrison felt years of loneliness and uncertainty fall away. He had a future now, a real one, bright with possibility. He had Josephine, if she'd have him, and the approval of the man whose opinion mattered most to her. It felt like waking up from a long, cold dream into warm sunlight. Martin stayed for dinner, and they discussed the details of his business proposal. It turned out Martin had contracts with several mining operations to supply equipment and provisions, a lucrative venture that required careful management. With Josephine's help handling the books and Harrison's input on practical matters, the business could expand even further. It was more than Harrison had ever imagined for himself, but he found himself warming to the idea. Not for the money, though that would certainly help, but because it would give Josephine something of her own, a way to use her considerable talents. After Martin left, Harrison stood in his cabin and looked around with new eyes. It was small and rough, built for function rather than comfort. He'd need to expand it before Josephine arrived. Add a proper bedroom at least, maybe a second room for her to work in. New furniture. Those curtains she'd mentioned. He made a mental list of supplies he'd need to buy in town, projects he could complete in a week if he worked dawn to dusk. He spent the next 6 days in a frenzy of activity. He built a frame addition onto the back of the cabin and raised walls, working through the evenings by lamplight. He bought lumber and nails, fabric and dishes, a real bed frame to replace his simple rope bed. He cleaned everything until it shone, hung the new curtains Josephine had sent in an earlier package, and filled the cabin with wildflowers gathered from the meadows. By the time the 3-month deadline arrived, he was exhausted but satisfied. The cabin was transformed, ready to be a home. Josephine arrived on a bright morning exactly 3 months after she'd left. Harrison saw the wagon coming from a distance, and his heart started racing. He stood on his porch and watched her drive up, managing the horses with easy competence, and thought she'd never looked more beautiful. She wore a simple blue dress and her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but her eyes shone with joy as she pulled the wagon to a stop. "Hello, Harrison," she said, and her voice trembled slightly. "I hope I'm not too early. I left but before dawn. I couldn't wait any longer." Harrison was down the porch steps in 2 strides. He reached up and lifted her down from the wagon, his hands spanning her waist, and for a moment they just stood there looking at each other. "You're not early. You're exactly on time." He cupped her face in his hands, marveling that she was real, that she was here. "I've missed you so much. I've missed you too, every single day." She leaned into his touch, her eyes filling with tears. "Harrison, I've done what you asked. I've thought about everything carefully. I've considered what I want from life and what kind of future I'm choosing. And my answer is you. It's always been you, if you'll still have me." Instead of answering with words, Harrison kissed her. It was different from that desperate kiss in the darkness 3 months ago. This was a kiss of greeting and promise, of coming home and new beginnings. Josephine kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, and Harrison felt complete for the first time in his life. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Harrison kept his forehead pressed against hers. "Marry me, Josephine, be my wife. Let me spend the rest of my life making you happy." "Yes, yes to all of it," she laughed, giddy with joy. "I already have my things in the wagon. Uncle Martin helped me pack everything yesterday. He told me about your conversation about the business partnership. Is that really what you want? What I want is you. The business is just a bonus, a way to give us more security. But even if your uncle hadn't offered it, my answer would be the same. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep holding you every night. I want to build a life with you, whatever form that takes." Josephine pulled back to look at the cabin and her eyes widened. "Harrison, what did you do? The cabin is bigger. Added a bedroom and a workroom. Figured we'd need the space. Come see." He gave her a tour of the improvements, watching her face light up as she took in the new furniture. The curtains she'd made hanging in the windows, the wildflowers he'd placed in jars throughout the rooms. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with the new bed covered in quilts. The workroom had a desk and shelves, a place for her to manage the business accounts. "It's perfect," Josephine said, tears streaming down her face. "Harrison, it's absolutely perfect. You did all this for me, for us." He pulled her close again, unable to stop touching her now that she was finally here. "I want you to be happy here, Josephine. I want this to feel like home. It already does. Home isn't a place, Harrison. It's wherever you are." They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony in Butte, with Martin as witness and Doc Morrison in attendance. Josephine wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, and Harrison wore his only suit, brushed clean and pressed. They said their vows in the small church on the edge of town, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever life brought. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Harrison kissed his bride with all the pent-up longing of the past months, and everyone in attendance cheered. The wedding dinner was held at the hotel restaurant, Martin's treat, and Harrison found himself surrounded by more goodwill than he'd experienced in years. The town had heard the story of the rescue in the storm, embellished with each retelling, and Harrison and Josephine were treated like local heroes. It was overwhelming and wonderful, and Harrison kept Josephine's hand clasped in his throughout the evening, anchoring himself to her presence. They drove back to the ranch as the sun set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber. Josephine leaned against Harrison's shoulder, and he wrapped his free arm around her, holding her close. The future stretched ahead of them, full of possibility and promise. They'd have challenges, he knew. Ranch life was hard, especially in the Montana winters. But they'd face everything together, and that made all the difference. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, both of them nervous and eager in equal measure. Harrison was gentle with Josephine, taking his time, learning what made her sigh and smile. And afterwards, lying together in the darkness with her head on his chest and her hand over his heart, he felt a peace he'd never known. "Tell me what you're thinking," Josephine whispered, tracing lazy circles on his skin. "I'm thinking about that storm. How if I'd ridden past that ravine, if I'd been 5 minutes earlier or later on the trail, I would have missed seeing you. How everything in my life led to that one moment, that one decision to climb down and pull you up, and how that moment changed everything." "It was fate," Josephine said softly. "It had to be. All the circumstances that had to align perfectly for us to find each other. The storm, the accident, the timing. If any one thing had been different, we might never have met. I don't know if I believe in fate, but I believe we were lucky, incredibly, impossibly lucky." Harrison kissed the top of her head. "And I promise you, Josephine, I'm not going to waste that luck. I'm going to spend every day appreciating this gift we've been given. We'll do it together. Everything from now on, we'll do together." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and when Harrison woke to find Josephine still in his arms, sunlight streaming through the window, he knew he'd finally found what he'd been searching for all his wandering years. Not just a place to call home, but someone to share it with. The first year of marriage was an adjustment. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, discovered what made each other laugh and what sparked arguments. Josephine threw herself into managing the business partnership with Martin, traveling to but twice a week to review accounts and meet with suppliers. Harrison expanded his herd and improved his grazing land, working harder than he ever had because now he had something to work for beyond simple survival. They had their disagreements. Josephine was stubborn and independent, not always willing to accept Harrison's help even when she needed it. Harrison was sometimes too protective, forgetting that his wife was capable and strong. But they learned to talk through their conflicts, to listen and compromise. And always, underlying everything, was the bone-deep certainty that they belonged together. Martin visited often, delighted with how his business was thriving under Josephine's management. The partnership proved even more successful than anticipated, providing Harrison and Josephine with financial security that allowed them to make improvements to the ranch and even save money for the future. Martin's leg healed well enough that he walked with only a slight limp, and his health remained good. He spoke occasionally of returning to Helena, but there was always one more contract to negotiate, one more business opportunity to explore and butt. The second winter brought heavy snows that isolated the ranch for weeks at a time. Harrison and Josephine were trapped together in the cabin, and instead of driving them crazy, the forced intimacy only drew them closer. They read aloud to each other in the evenings, played cards, talked for hours about everything and nothing. And when spring finally broke, Harrison found himself almost disappointed that their cozy isolation was ending. It was that spring that Josephine told him she was pregnant. Harrison was mending fence when she rode out to find him, her face flushed with excitement and nervousness. He saw her expression and knew immediately that something momentous had happened. He dropped his tools and met her halfway, catching her as she slid from her horse. "What is it? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. Everything's right. Harrison, we're going to have a baby." She watched his face anxiously. I'm about 3 months along, I think. I wasn't sure at first, but Doc Morrison confirmed it yesterday when I went to town. Harrison felt the world tilt and right itself in a new configuration. A baby. His child, their child, growing inside the woman he loved. It was terrifying and wonderful and more than he'd ever let himself hope for. A baby, he repeated, his voice choked. Josephine, we're having a baby. Are you happy? I know we didn't plan for this so soon, but I'm so happy, Harrison. I want this child so much. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Harrison pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, reverently. I'm scared to death and thrilled and so full of love I don't know how to contain it. You're giving me a family, Josephine. A real family. Do you know what that means to me? She was crying and laughing at the same time. We're going to be parents. We're going to bring a new life into this world and raise them and teach them everything we know. It's the most amazing, terrifying thing I can imagine. They stood in the spring meadow, surrounded by wildflowers and new grass, holding each other and dreaming about the future. Harrison thought about the lonely man he'd been just 2 years ago, convinced he was meant to live in isolation. And now here he was, married to an extraordinary woman, with a child on the way and a life full of love and possibility. Sometimes the journey from despair to joy was shorter than you imagined. Sometimes it took nothing more than climbing down a ravine in the pouring rain. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Josephine was sick for the first few months and exhausted for most of the rest. Harrison fussed over her constantly, driving her crazy with his protectiveness, until she finally sat him down and explained firmly that she was pregnant, not made of glass, and she'd tell him if she needed help. He tried to back off, with limited success. He couldn't help wanting to shield her from every difficulty, to make her path as easy as possible. Martin was delighted by the news and began planning immediately for the baby's arrival. He commissioned a cradle from a skilled carpenter in Butte and sent packages of baby clothes and blankets. He spoke seriously to Harrison about expanding the house again to accommodate the growing family, and offered to fund the construction. Harrison accepted gratefully, and by the time autumn arrived, the cabin had been transformed into a proper house with 3 bedrooms and a large main room. Josephine went into labor on a cold November night, 2 weeks before her due date. Harrison rode through the darkness to fetch Doc Morrison while Martin stayed with Josephine, holding her hand and speaking soothingly. By the time Harrison returned with the doctor, Josephine was deep in labor and Harrison's terror had reached new heights. "You've got to save her," he told Doc Morrison urgently, gripping the older man's arm. "Whatever happens, you have to make sure Josephine is all right. Promise me." "I'll do my best for both of them," Doc Morrison said calmly, prying Harrison's fingers loose. "But you need to trust me and let me work. Go boil water and tear up those clean sheets I asked for. Stay busy and let me focus." The next hours were the longest of Harrison's life. He paced the main room while Josephine's cries came from the bedroom, each one tearing at his heart. Martin sat quietly, but his face was drawn with worry. They didn't speak, both men lost in their private fears. Finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, Harrison heard a new sound. A thin, indignant wail that grew stronger as the baby protested its entrance into the world. Harrison was on his feet instantly, but Doc Morrison appeared in the doorway before he could rush into the bedroom. "You have a son," the doctor said, smiling broadly. "A healthy boy with a good set of lungs, and your wife is tired but fine. She did beautifully." Harrison's knees went weak with relief. "Can I see them? Give me a few minutes to clean up, then you can meet your son." Those minutes felt eternal, but finally Doc Morrison waved him in. Josephine was propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion. But she was smiling, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Harrison approached slowly, hardly daring to breathe, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a surprising amount of dark hair. His eyes were squeezed shut and his fists waved in the air as he made small, mewling sounds. He was the most beautiful thing Harrison had ever seen. "You want to hold him?" Josephine asked softly. Harrison nodded, not trusting his voice. Josephine showed him how to support the baby's head, then carefully transferred the bundle to his arms. Harrison looked down at his son and felt his entire world reorganize itself around this tiny person. He was a father now. He had responsibilities and commitments that went beyond anything he'd known before, and he welcomed it all with his whole heart. "He's perfect," Harrison whispered. "Josephine, he's absolutely perfect. You're perfect. I can't believe this is real. What should we name him?" Josephine watched them both with shining eyes. "We talked about several names, but now that he's here, I want to hear what feels right to you." Harrison studied his son's face, trying out different names in his mind. Then one settled into place with a rightness that couldn't be denied. "Henry. Henry Martin Reeves, for both our fathers and for your uncle who brought us together." Josephine's eyes filled with tears. "Henry Martin, it's perfect. Uncle Martin will be so honored." They told Martin the name when he was finally allowed in to meet his great-nephew, and the older man was indeed overcome with emotion. He held baby Henry with practiced ease and declared him the finest child ever born. He stayed with them for a week, helping out around the ranch while Josephine recovered, and Harrison saw the deep contentment in his face. Martin had his family back, expanded and thriving, and it clearly meant everything to him. The years that followed were rich and full. Henry grew into a lively child with his mother's dark eyes and his father's stubborn determination. When he was 3, Josephine gave birth to twin daughters, Rose and Sarah, who turned the household into cheerful chaos. Harrison built another addition to accommodate the expanding family, and the ranch prospered under his careful management. Martin eventually did return to Helena, but he visited often and maintained his business interests in Butte. The partnership continued to provide steady income, allowing Harrison and Josephine to hire help for the ranch during busy seasons. They never became wealthy, but they had more than enough. More importantly, they had each other and their children and a life filled with purpose and love. On quiet evenings, after the children were asleep, Harrison and Josephine would sit on their porch and watch the sun set behind the mountains. Sometimes they talked about their days, sharing stories and making plans. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, their hands linked, simply enjoying each other's presence. And sometimes, Josephine would lean against Harrison's shoulder and remind him of that storm, that moment when he'd looked down into a ravine and decided to climb down rather than ride past. "Best decision I ever made," Harrison would always say. "Best decision we both made," Josephine would correct. "I chose to come back to you. I chose this life, this love. And I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over." Harrison would kiss her temple, breathing in her familiar scent. "Every single time I'd climb down into that ravine, I'd carry you up through the rain. I'd open my home and my heart, because it led me here to this moment, to this life with you." Years passed, and their children grew. Henry became a strong, capable young man who helped his father run the ranch with increasing skill. Rose showed her mother's head for numbers and took over much of the business management. Sarah had inherited her father's quiet strength and her mother's compassionate heart, and she spoke of becoming a teacher. Martin lived to see his great-grandchildren grow into young adults, passing peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, satisfied that his family was secure and thriving. Harrison and Josephine grew older together, their hair turning gray, their faces lined with years of laughter and work. But their love never dimmed. If anything, it deepened, becoming richer and more complex with each passing year. They knew each other's thoughts without speaking, moved in harmony born of decades together, and still found new ways to surprise and delight each other. When Harrison turned 50, Josephine organized a celebration at the ranch. All their children were there, along with grandchildren who'd begun arriving as Henry and his wife started their own family. Friends from town made the journey out, and the house rang with laughter and music. Harrison stood on his porch, watching Josephine move through the crowd with effortless grace, and marveled at how blessed he'd been. Doc Morrison, ancient now but still sharp, came to stand beside him. "You did well for yourself, Harrison. Built a good life here." "I got lucky," Harrison said. "If that storm had been an hour later, if I'd taken a different trail that day, everything would be different." "Luck had something to do with it, sure. But you made the choice to stop, to help. You made the choice to love. That's not luck, that's character." The old doctor clapped him on the shoulder. "Your parents would be proud of the man you became." After everyone left and the house was quiet again, Harrison found Josephine cleaning up in the kitchen. He took the dish from her hands and set it aside, then pulled her into his arms. She came willingly, fitting against him as perfectly as she had 30 years ago. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what? For choosing me. For building this life with me. For giving me everything I didn't know I was missing." Josephine pulled back to look at him, her eyes soft with love. "You gave me just as much. You gave me a home, a family, a purpose. You gave me love when I thought I'd never feel it again. We saved each other, Harrison. That's what we did." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, pouring decades of devotion into the gesture. And when they finally broke apart, both of them were smiling. They lived many more years in that house on the Montana ranch, watching their family grow and expand, weathering storms both literal and metaphorical. They faced loss and hardship, as all lives contain both, but they faced everything together, their bond unbreakable. When Harrison was 68, a bad winter brought pneumonia that laid him low for weeks. Josephine nursed him with the same fierce determination she'd shown caring for her uncle all those years ago, refusing to let him give up. And when he recovered, weak but alive, the first thing he said to her was what he'd said so many times before: "Best decision I ever made." Josephine, her own health fragile now but her spirit undiminished, smiled and kissed his forehead. "Best decision we both made." They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. The house Harrison had built was full to bursting with family. 3 generations gathered to honor the love story that had started in a ravine during a storm. Stories were shared, songs were sung, and when Harrison stood to make a toast, his voice was rough with emotion. 40 years ago, I was a lonely man convinced I was meant to live in isolation. Then a storm came, and with it came the greatest gift of my life. My wife, my partner, my heart. Josephine, you've made every day of these 40 years worth living. You've given me a family, a home, and a love I'll carry into whatever comes next. Here's to 40 more years if we're lucky. And if not, here's to making every remaining day count. Everyone raised their glasses and cheered, but Josephine's eyes were locked on Harrison's, shining with tears and joy. Later, when everyone had gone to bed and they were alone in their room, she took his hands in hers. "However many days we have left, I want to spend every single one of them with you," she said. "You've been my whole world, Harrison Reeves, the best part of me, the best part of my life. The feeling is entirely mutual, Mrs. Reeves." They lay down together in the bed they'd shared for 4 decades, wrapped in each other's arms, and fell asleep to the sound of their grandchildren's laughter drifting through the house. Harrison Reeves lived to the age of 73, passing peacefully with his wife at his side and his family surrounding him. His last words were for Josephine, a whispered, "I love you," that she returned with her whole heart. He was laid to rest on a hill overlooking his ranch, under a wide Montana sky, and at his funeral, their children and grandchildren spoke of his kindness, his strength, his unwavering devotion to family. Josephine lived 5 more years, kept vital by her children's love and the joy of watching her grandchildren grow. She spent her final years in the house she and Harrison had built together, surrounded by memories and photographs and love. And when it was her time, she went peacefully in her sleep, a smile on her face, finally reunited with the man who'd climbed down into a ravine in the pouring rain to save her life. They were buried side by side on that hill, their graves marked with simple stones that bore their names and dates, and below that, a single inscription: "Together always." The ranch stayed in the family, passed down through generations, and the story of how it all began became family legend. Great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren grew up hearing about the storm, the ravine, the cowboy who'd stopped to help a stranger and found his soulmate. The house was expanded and modernized over the years, but the original cabin that Harrison built remained at its heart, preserved as a reminder of where it all started. And sometimes, on stormy nights when rain hammered the Montana hillsides and lightning split the sky, those who lived in the house would swear they could feel something in the air, a sense of presence, of enduring love. As if somewhere in the fabric of that place, Harrison and Josephine's story was still unfolding, still reaching across time to remind everyone who came after them that love, real love, was worth any risk, any sacrifice. That sometimes the greatest gifts came in the middle of storms. That sometimes you had to climb down into darkness and danger to find the light. And that when you found it, when you found that person who made your whole world make sense, you held on with everything you had and never let go. The story of Harrison Reeves and Josephine Zimmerman became more than just family history. It became a testament to the power of choice, of compassion, of opening your heart even when you'd convinced yourself to keep it closed. It reminded generation after generation that love could bloom in the most unexpected places, that it could transform loneliness into belonging, that it could turn a simple cabin into a home filled with laughter and life. And on clear nights when the stars shone bright over the Montana ranch, if you stood on that hill where Harrison and Josephine lay at rest, you could almost hear it. The echo of a promise kept, a love honored, a life well lived. You could almost see them, young again and whole, standing hand in hand and looking out over the land they'd built together, still choosing each other, still climbing up from that ravine together into the light. Their great-great-granddaughter, named Josephine in honor of her ancestor, stood on that hill on her wedding day, 90 years after the original Josephine had married Harrison. She wore her great-great-grandmother's locket and carried wildflowers like the ones Harrison had gathered for his bride. And as she prepared to marry her own love, she touched the gravestone and whispered a thank you to the 2 people who'd started it all. "Thank you for being brave," she said softly. "Thank you for choosing love when it would have been easier to stay alone. Thank you for building this family, this legacy. I promise to honor it. I promise to love as fearlessly as you did." The wind picked up, rustling through the grass, and young Josephine could have sworn she heard a whisper of approval, of blessing. She smiled and walked down the hill to where her future husband waited, ready to write her own chapter in the family's continuing story, because love stories don't really end. They echo forward, inspiring those who come after, showing them what's possible when you open your heart to hope. And the story of a cowboy who climbed down into a ravine in the pouring rain, who carried an unconscious woman to safety and found his whole world in the process, would echo for generations to come. A reminder that sometimes the most important decision you'll ever make happens in a single moment. And that when you choose love, choose courage, choose compassion, you create ripples that spread far beyond your own lifetime. Harrison and Josephine Reeves had built more than a ranch, more than a family. They'd built a legacy of love that would endure as long as the Montana mountains stood tall against the sky. And that was the greatest gift of all, the truest measure of a life well lived. Not wealth or fame or power, but love. Simple, profound, transformative love. The kind that starts with a storm and lasts forever.